invite you to take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 12 as we continue the story of Scripture. Genesis chapter 12. In just a minute, we're going to read verses 1 through 3. When I was in seminary, I missed an exam, and the professor allowed me to make it up. It was church history exam, and normally you have 2 courses in church history. So you're covering roughly 2,000 years, and so this course was a midterm, and one of the courses was over 500 years of church history. So I in this little office outside of his office, and I have an envelope. I open the envelope. Inside of there is the exam, and the exam just had one question. And you'd think that was good news, but here was the question. List all the major events of church history we've studied so far and describe them. So it's a really, really short question, but with a really, really long answer, right? Lots of pages to work that out. And there's a sense in which in Genesis chapter 12, we come to a very, very pivotal moment in all of the Bible and of all of human history. Because everything up to this point that God has done, in a sense, has not worked. Think about that. And so now the big question is, what is God going to do? Creation, Genesis 1 and 2, but that's immediately followed by the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 4, first murder, Cain kills Abel. Genesis chapter 5, humanity reaches a high mark of depravity. Sexual immorality, violence, and the known world at that time is ruled by a group of people we don't really understand called the Nephilim, that are a race of giant people that are just wielding their power, doing whatever they want to do. It's an awful world. So God's next step, how he responds to that, is through a flood, a worldwide flood, and starts over. New human race under Noah. That ends in Genesis chapter 6, and it goes well up until chapter 10, or chapter 9. Chapter 9 and 10, the very next chapter. Because Noah gets off the ark, and he gets drunk, and that leads to all kinds of sin. He didn't accidentally get drunk. There were no grapes that existed. He had to grow them, mature them, and then there he gets drunk, and again, that leads to all kinds of problems. And you have the Tower of Babel. And so what is God going to do next? This is a dumpster fire, if you will. At church this week, in the middle of the week, we had a dumpster fire, a literal dumpster caught on fire. And so we were taking this picture and passing around. Sometimes God gives you a metaphor that describes reality, right? Helpful. Here's this dumpster fire that's raging. This is where we get in Genesis chapter 11. So what is God going to do next? That's the short question. The answer is Genesis 12 through Revelation 22. The whole rest of the Bible is the long answer to the short question, what is God going to do next? So here's what he does first. It's found in Genesis chapter 12, as he starts a family. Not the first family, Adam and Eve, not the start over family in Noah, but by keeping all the rest of humanity alive, he puts a family inside the human race. So all of humanity, and then a unique family. That was his plan, and it still is his plan today. So here's the family that God started in Genesis chapter 12. Let's read it. Verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now who is Abram? We're going to know him later as Abraham. Well, we don't know anything unique really about him, a few details, but we know that he was related to Shem, who was one of Noah's sons who got off the ark. But that's kind of the point. In other words, Abraham didn't apply for this and qualify. God just chose him. He was going to be the one from which God would start this new race of people, this new family. And God said, I want you to go from your country to your father's house to the land that I will show you. Verse 2, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and in him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So we call this the Abrahamic covenant. It's the first time, although there's a covenant with humanity and with the earth and with Adam found in Genesis chapter 3, this is the first time that language is used. And remember, a covenant is a unique promise that's initiated by God that lasts forever, that's eternal. And so we're still under this Abrahamic covenant. The covenant had three parts. It had a land, verse 1, I'm going to make you a great nation. In other words, you're going to have this tremendous family, verse 2. And then you're going to be a blessing to all the world, verse 3. Well, God gave that covenant to one person. He gave it to Abraham. But none of that can be fulfilled without a family. That's the backdrop to all of this. After all, why do you need great land if it's just yourself? You can't be a great nation alone. Now let's talk about his family. And the way we know he's going to bless the whole world, his family is going to do that. He's not going to do that. From him, his family is going to bless the whole world. We see that when his family ultimately winds up in Egypt and blesses that pagan nation, or more specifically here in Genesis chapter 37 through 39, where we have Joseph, who is his great-grandson, who's blessing Potiphar's house, and the hand of the Lord is upon him. So all kinds of ways, and then ultimately the world is blessed through the person of Jesus. So our text this morning is Genesis 12 through Genesis 50. We won't go verse by verse, so we have to figure out another way to do it to cover all of this. So we're going to focus on this family. I just want to ask three questions about this family, but toward the idea of moving us along. And our goal, remember, is a macro view. A lot of details we're going to leave out, but hopefully details you've heard before, you can plug into this, and things you'll hear later, you can plug into this macro level structure, working, as we said so many times, off Matthew 1:1, the covenants from Abraham to David and the new covenant in Jesus. All right, so let's talk about this family. Three questions we'll ask about this family. First of all, who is this family that he's describing? Well, if you want, this will help you understand it. I want you to write down the names of three couples. Here they are. First is Abraham and Sarah. You say, why using Abraham and Sarah? Didn't God give the covenant to Abraham? Yes, but he decided to carry it out through Sarah. In fact, he said Sarah is going to be the one that's going to give birth to Isaac. Isaac was the son of promise. They had tried to do another way and it didn't fail. It had to come through Sarah. And then in this incredible story, he has this son, Isaac, the son of promise, and he gets married, and his wife's name is Rebekah, Isaac and Rebekah. It's a beautiful love story. You can read it. I think it's around chapter 26 of Genesis. So Abraham and Sarah, and then Isaac and Rebekah. And then you have Isaac's son, Jacob, who God is going to change his name later to Israel. He's going to have 12 sons. Don't get ahead of me, but guess what comes from that? The 12 sons of Israel, that you have the tribes now, all the rest of the Old Testament. So that's it. So that's Genesis, and all the rest of the Old Testament comes from that. The focus of that is the last few chapters are one of Jacob's sons named Joseph. He's the focus of that, and we'll see why in just a minute. And so with the name Jacob, you can put Rachel and Leah. You say, well, that's two wives. That's right. You say, is that right? Yep, that's right. You say, well, that's weird. Wait till you read the rest of Genesis. That's just the beginning. It gets unbelievably strange, but in God's providence, that's the way it materialized. So you have Abraham and Sarah, the first couple. Then you have Isaac and Rebekah, and then you have Jacob and Leah and Rachel, and a big focus at the end on one of Jacob's sons, which is Joseph. A lot more we could say, but that's a macro view of Genesis 12 all the way through Genesis 50. All right, so that's who they are. Now, God's plan is a family plan. Again, Genesis 1 through 11, what's God going to do? He puts in a family. It's a family plan. So let's ask the second question, and is, what is the plan? Well, it's found right here back in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. The plan is they're going to have this land, they're going to receive this blessing, and that they're going to be a blessing to all the nations. So we describe the family plan. Let me describe it in two words that won't be a surprise to you. The two words are presence and mission. Part of the plan, and this is very interesting, is a shift. God appeared to the whole world, all the people that were created, Adam and Eve, back in the garden, but he's not doing that anymore. But it's interesting, so fascinating. When you get to Genesis chapter 12, the frequency of God's appearances really tick up because he's not appearing to everyone in the world. He's just appearing to this family. I'll read a few examples, although you can look a lot of them in Genesis chapter 12. It says this, verse 7, then the Lord appeared to Abraham. This is Genesis 17:1. The Lord appeared to Abraham. And then chapter 18 and verse 2, again, the Lord appeared to him, this time in the form of 3 angels who come, but he calls one of them Lord. We think chapter 18 is one of these Old Testament appearances of Jesus again. It seems so clear. And then in chapter 26 and verse 2, this is a really notable appearance to Isaac. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land in which I shall tell you. There's a famine in the land, and God gives him guidance as to what to do. And then in chapter 35 and verse 1, it says that make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau, speaking to Jacob. And then if you go further into chapter 39, in fact, I'll just do this, chapter 39, speaking of Joseph, it says that even though he was a slave in Egypt, you know the story of Joseph, it says that the Lord was with him, verse 3. And then Genesis 39 and verse 23, the Lord was with him. And in the back of it, 21, the Lord was with him. And so we're trying to describe the family plan. The family plan begins with this premise that God's going to be with them. He's not going to leave them alone. And it's in a unique way. Now, those of us that grew up in a church context, we understand that. Not everyone in Arkansas or Little Rock is worshiping God this morning. Most of them aren't. But you are. We're here seeking the presence of God together. That's the premise of all of this. That there became this family, and the unique feature of this family is that they have the unique access and relationship to God. Now, the presence of God. Now, why does God do that? You say, God's not appearing to the rest of the world. No. After Babel, we don't see any of these massive declarations of God to other people. It seems exclusive, we might think, to just appear to his people. Why is he doing it that way? Well, that's a very, very good question, and I hope you're thinking that because it helps us understand Genesis chapter 12 again. So if you're in Genesis 12, go back, look at verse 2. It's so important. And I will make you a great nation. So he's already promised the land, now the great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So circle those 2 words, so that. We might back up and ask the question, why Abraham? Why all these appearances? Abraham receives all these blessings. He receives material blessings. He gets to hear the voice of God. He gets to be led by God. Isaac receives all these blessings. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes. All these blessings. Joseph is tremendously blessed. Why does God relate to them? It's very, very clear. So that they can bless the nations. So God's presence, as we've seen so many times before and we'll see again, leads to God's mission. And that has not changed. God still is leading us on mission based upon the fact that we have his presence. There are all kinds of blessings that we receive, but those blessings are to be received in a way where we ask the question, how can we be a blessing to other people? We have a Bible study on Wednesday nights, and for the men, we have another one on Tuesday mornings. They mirror each other, same content. And for the ladies, we have one on Wednesday night and one on Monday mornings, and would love for you to come to those. But I asked the guys this last week in both groups, I asked them a specific question. And here it is, and I'll ask you again, although you don't have to raise your hand. So here's the question. When you drive and use the GPS on a road trip, do you like to have the audio on or off? So just think about that for a minute. What do you think about that? Audio on or off? So in the Tuesday morning group, only one guy raised his hand and said he'd like to have the audio on. And I think we handled that well. We stared at him, made him feel isolated, alone. That's what friends are for. That's how you know he's a good friend. But on Wednesday night, it was kind of split, about 50-50. And this is a constant source of tension in our marriage because, frankly, I think the GPS is already bossy enough, right? Telling me where to go, don't turn here. You know, as a men, we already know this. I know where to go, right? This is an aid, but I essentially know where I'm going, my wife likes to have it on, and so I always prevail on her, please turn the audio off, and then we get lost. We miss a turn or something. And so, listen, when you miss a turn, the GPS says, what is it doing? What's it going to tell you it's going to do? Recalculating, right. Now, what the GPS could do is it could drive me off a cliff, right? This guy doesn't need to be alive anymore. He's making so many wrong turns. It could say, please pull over. Let your wife drive. You're not responsible enough to be driving this vehicle. Why does it give me another chance? Why does it recalculate? Well, because that's its default system, made by humans, for humans, anticipating that the humans are not going to do it right. They're going to get lost. They're going to disobey the GPS, and they're going to need to be reset. So no matter what you do, it all comes back to that. And there's a real sense in which, when you look at all that God does from here on out, there's a default position that God has. We'll see it all the way through the Old Testament. We'll see it all the way through the New Testament, and it drives what we're doing here at the church. Oh God, could we be in your presence? Not just so we can be blessed, but bless us so that we could be a blessing. And from Maryland to missions all over the world, God blesses us so that we could be a blessing. November 5th through 12th, we'll do something we haven't done in many, many years. We're going to have our GO conference, which simply means the individual mission partnerships that we have. We're bringing here. Those missionaries are going to come in. They'll be in your Sunday school classrooms. You can invite them into your homes. And the challenge is going to be, especially on 12th, when you get to hear from KP Phillips, who leads For All Mankind Ministries, will be to respond to that by going on a trip, by supporting those who do, by, as we go into our missions offering in the fall, investing in international missions. And I'm not trying to make you feel guilty about that. That's not the point. God can do that if he wants to convict you. I just want to make a simple observation. And that's why you're blessed. Any thinking person has to think about it, right? I mean, why do we get to live here in America? Why do we get to live in this beautiful state? I met somebody this morning from West Texas. I mean, think about that. You could be living in West Texas right now, I've been there. It's not good. Here's the answer. The reason why we're blessed is so that we could be a blessing. We're not a reservoir. We're a conduit. It flows through us into other people and for the gospel. So when we say we're for the gospel, for the city, for the world, the first one drives the other. The gospel implies that God's going to take our blessings and our resources and use them to be a blessing to others. And the seeds of that go back to the first family. The pattern of our church family, our local church family, the seeds of that are back in there as well. And as we're going to see in a minute, those promises are still extended to us in many ways. God is blessing the world now through the church, if you will. So, we're asking who this family was. We gave those three couples and then added Joseph. What's the family plan that God has? It's his presence and his mission. He blesses us so that we can bless others. And now, let's talk about the family culture. Every family has its own unique culture, things that are unique to you, and the way you operate, the way you do things, the way you live your life. And so let's describe the family culture of this first family. And if we had to describe it in a phrase, we could say this. They were a family of incredible faith and deep, deep failures. Incredible faith and deep failures. The faith of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and later Joseph and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, all the faith is very, very well documented. It's phenomenal. In fact, it's so profound that the writer of the Hebrews says this. Listen to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he has to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. It was the promised land, but he didn't know that. He just took the first next step. And the revelation of what was next came after the obedience. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents, with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, listen to this, whose designer and builder is God. In other words, it wasn't just about taking the next step of faith. He had such a macro view of things. He was looking forward to heaven. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, and she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand in the seashore. So incredible, incredible faith. God was leading them out. All this was new. Just like when there's a new step of faith God calls you to, just all new. You don't have all the revelation. In fact, even the covenant is going to be defined and narrowed throughout chapters 15, 16, and 17 a little bit later. God is clarifying what he initially meant, but God just gives you the bits of information which you need to obey at the moment. And that's what he was giving to Abraham. He was stepping into that. But they were also a family of deep, deep failure. So here's some examples. In the same chapter in which he gets the promise, chapter 12, in the same chapter in which he becomes the father, the lead patriarch of the faith, the very first Jewish person, if you will. Just right after that, they go down to Egypt. They travel through there, Abraham and Sarah. Abraham thinks, he's suspicious, and he thinks someone's going to kill me because my wife is beautiful. Kill me and take her. And so he says to Sarah, let's lie and say you're my sister, so that way I won't be killed. It was good for Abraham, it was bad for Sarah. She was abducted by the king. He had the power to do that. The Pharaoh just takes her in. So God begins to curse, if you will, Pharaoh's life because of her being in there, and Pharaoh gives her back and said, why did you lie to me? He finds out the lie. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he does it again. And in chapter 26, later on, Isaac, after God has this incredible love story with Isaac and Rebekah, he does it to her. And then Jacob, the one who God is going to change his name to Israel, gets his birthright, you know the story perhaps, by lying. He lies to his father Isaac on his deathbed and pretends that he's his brother so that he'll get a blessing that will pass on to him. You say, well, that's bad. Well, that's just the leaders. For there it gets horrible. Murder, incest, rape, prostitution, lying, deception. It just goes on and on and on. You say, well, that's a really, really dysfunctional family. It is. And if you're thinking, you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. So we've said Genesis 3 to 11, kind of a dumpster fire. God's response, what is God going to do? That's the big question. Well, he steps in and he provides a family. Couldn't we also say that doesn't work? Because all those things we just described happened after God instituted the family. What's the big change? Here it is, listen very carefully. The big change now is God's covenant promise. No matter what happens from this point, God has a family that he absolutely will never abandon. It's exclusive to him. Now just think about this. The presence of God back in the garden was to all humans. Now it's just to this family. The mission of God was to all humans. I want you to go out, be fruitful and multiply. Go out from here, populate the earth, but not now. This mission of God is exclusive to those who have the presence of God to go out and to bless the world based upon how God has blessed them. So God's plan is not that everybody will be perfect. God's plan is not his family will be perfect. His plan is simply that his covenant promise will always be faithful to his family who is left inside of this cursed world, and even in the families bear the shame and consequences of the sin that we commit. So again, the plan hasn't changed. You still come to God by faith. In fact, look at Genesis chapter 15. If you're in 12, just turn the page over to Genesis chapter 15. This is going to be a familiar passage to you. Genesis chapter 15. In verse 6, after God makes a renewed and clarified promise to him, it says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And what does that mean? Well, it implies that Abraham wasn't righteous, right? God didn't say, who's my best candidate who can carry out my mission? No, that's not the issue. If he was righteous, he wouldn't need to get righteousness. God's counting something. In other words, it doesn't exist, so he's counting it. So why did God count him? Well, because he believed by faith. That sounds a lot like the gospel, doesn't it? None of us are righteous. We can't have access to God because of our sinfulness. So what God does, he doesn't pretend. He never pretends, hey, look, no big deal, don't worry about it. What God does, he says, look, you're not righteous. I demand righteousness, so I'm going to provide for you my son who is perfect righteousness. He's going to intercept my wrath on your behalf. I'm going to credit his life back to you, and you can't earn this, but you can believe. And if you believe, I'm going to credit that as you receiving something that you really didn't earn at all. And the gospel here is embedded here so clearly that you remember Romans chapter 3, as Paul is just beginning to explain and walk out what the gospel is, he uses Abraham as the template. He believed, God counted his righteousness. So you believe in Jesus, and God calls you to righteousness. So that faith has not changed. And the failure has not changed. You open up the New Testament. God provides the ultimate communication in Jesus. This is exactly what I'm leading you to do. Jesus goes back into heaven. In the very first book, the book of Acts, there's a scrap in chapter 6 about how things should be administrated. And then in the book of Romans, you remember there's a scrap over how salvation comes. Does it come the Jewish way or the new Gentile way? You get into 1 Corinthians, there's sexual immorality. You get into Galatians, there's racism. Peter not believing that other people can come the right way. So the faith has not changed. You still come by faith to receive Christ's righteousness. And the failure that we experience in our local churches, that as well has not changed. So every time we come to a text like this, every time, especially as we're going through the story of Scripture, we're asking ourselves this question: how does this make me love Jesus more? And I say that because, not in a sentimental way, we love Jesus by obeying him, but our affections in our heart, how our heart is bent and what it's bent toward, they should be warmed. They should be heated up. And the same passion we have for football or for hunting or for whatever our hobbies and interests are should be turned toward Jesus. As a result of seeing him, we should love him more. And here's what makes us love Jesus more out of this passage. It's what the kids quoted a minute ago. Did you listen as they were quoting Psalm 100? Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. I'm reading, not quoting. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his what? Sheep of his pasture. Thank you, first graders. They all got it. Trekking along. What makes Jesus so wonderful, as we look at Genesis 12 through 50, is that he's shepherding this whole process along. That shouldn't surprise us, because ultimately Jesus is going to die for the church. He's going to die for this family. His death is so powerful that whosoever will may come. If anybody wants to believe, they can believe. It's so powerful that anyone can come into the family, but only actually is effective for those who are in the family. And so Jesus, knowing from the moment, the inception of creation, this is coming, shepherds and nurtures this whole process along, all the way to the cross. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus drops down in the Old Testament. He's the good shepherd. He's leading his sheep through this entire process. So can I just say, what a sweet thing it is to be nurtured by Jesus in his church. What a privilege it is to be a part of a local church, knowing that Jesus is leading the stream all the way along. Makes us love Jesus because he leads us. And we see that gospel from Genesis 3, where the promise is made that the snake is going to be crushed, we see that all the way through to when we get to the New Testament, we realize this is not a new plan. It was always the plan. The word gospel means good news. So in the depravity and darkness of these situations, God comes in and he drops good news. Good news, Eve, while you're cursed, one day from you is going to come a seed who's going to rise up and crush the head of the serpent. It's good news. Good news, Abraham, even though in your dark, dark situation, from you is going to come someone, and from him is going to bless the nations. Seeds of the gospel there that are really, really good news. And good news, Isaac, you're going to have a son, and from him will come these 12 tribes. That's really, really good news. And good news to you, Jacob, because even though all this famine is taking place and all this land is going on, there's going to be someone who's from your own lineage, your own family, who's going to save you. And that leads us to the last thing to talk about. That is the story of Joseph. You know the story well. But what I want us to see this morning is how it fits. Here's how it fits. So again, the youngest of these sons, of the 12 sons of Jacob, is named Joseph. His brothers hate him. They hate him because he's his father's favorite, and the father does not hide his favoritism too well. They also hate him because he has these visions and these dreams that his brother's going to serve him. And you know, if you have a favorite, it's a good thing to hide that, right? It's not good for that one. And then if you have these visions that your family's going to serve you, again, a good thing to keep to yourself, but he doesn't. And his brothers decide to kill him, take his clothes, cover him in blood, go back to his dad and say, you know, we're out tending the sheep, and he got killed. Wild animal took him. So they do that. They don't kill him. They have mercy on him, and they throw him in a pit, which is the same thing because you couldn't extract yourself from this type of pit. As they're doing this, some Egyptian slave traders come by. It's a fascinating story. So again, Genesis 36 through the end, the chapter 50, read that. And these slave traders are collecting slaves, they're taking back to Egypt. And so they said, well, why shouldn't we profit from this? So his brothers sell him, take the money, and go back and tell his father that he's dead. And his father is devastated. He's never really the same again. And so Joseph, who hadn't done anything wrong, gets sold as a slave. And he finds himself in a land in which he's never been before. Doesn't know the language, doesn't know the culture. But something good happened. Chapter 39 again says the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. And so as he's working as a slave in the house of one of the officials there by the name of Potiphar, God's given these incredible blessings until he's falsely accused of something. And when he's falsely accused, he gets sent to prison. So first he's sold into slavery. That's bad enough. Then God starts to bless. It seems like it needs to be good. But then he's sold and he goes back into prison. He interprets some dreams while he's in prison. That gets him a reputation as someone who can interpret dreams. And when Pharaoh, the king of the land, has a dream that needs to be interpreted, word gets back to him. Joseph is brought up, interprets the dream. The dream was about a famine that's coming to take out Egypt. In the dream, he actually lays out a plan by which the whole nation can be saved. And Pharaoh makes this incredible statement. He says, where else is anyone like this who actually has this wisdom? So, since you've come up with a plan, Joseph, why don't you stay and execute the plan? And you will answer to no one except to me. He becomes the second most important person in the country. And when Joseph executes the plan, he not only saves Egypt, but as Egypt is prospering, his family that's back in the promised land, he sends for them. That's another dramatic story. They come in, and not only is Egypt saved, he blesses the nations, but it's the salvation for his whole family. And that's the end of Genesis. So why does God end it that way? We don't know. But it definitely makes us love Jesus more. Because in Joseph, we see such a clear picture of Jesus. And Jesus came into a foreign land like Joseph came into a foreign land. Joseph was excluded by his own family. Jesus was rejected by his own family. Joseph was treated very much unfairly, and Jesus was treated very much unfairly. Joseph had some people who loved him and hated him, and Jesus had people who loved him and hated him. And eventually, Joseph is extracted from the prison in the same way that Jesus is extracted from the grave, and he is exalted to be the second most important. And at the king's right hand, he saves his own family. And today, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, and he's saving us. He is sustaining us and keeping us saved by his presence from the Father. Why God ends the book of Genesis that way, we don't know, but we can only say this: it makes us love Jesus more. Because he came, was rejected, isolated, rose from the dead, and he saved all of his own family and all who would ever believe in him. And for that, we give Jesus all the glory and all the praise.